July 3, 1812. The night in Houston, Texas, was heavy, so heavy that even the crickets seemed to know silence was safer than song. The air was thick, clinging, suffocating. A storm hovered somewhere on the horizon, its distant thunder crawling like a warning across the black sky. In the fields, cotton bent under the ghostly moonlight, but among those endless rows of white, there were darker shadows. Shadows with eyes, shadows with scars, shadows who had learned that the earth itself could remember blood. And there, in the middle of that haunted earth, stood a boy. His name was Solomon Carter. Just 13 years old, but already older than men twice his age. Born into chains, born into silence, he had never known a single day when the sun rose without hunger, or the night fell without fear. He was not supposed to matter. He was not supposed to be remembered. To the men who owned him, he was nothing but another small brown back bent over cotton. To the women who had survived long enough to watch him grow, he was a child to protect, though they had no shield except the broken bones of their own lives. Solomon was different. The masters had seen it. He was too handsome for the fields. His skin smooth, his features sharp, his eyes dark and burning like coals that would never die. Too quiet to draw attention, too obedient to spark punishment, too careful to ever seem dangerous. He never spoke unless spoken to, never looked a white man directly in the eyes, never gave them a reason to raise the whip. And so they thought him perfect. A child like that could be trained. A child like that could be molded. A child like that could be taken into the master's house, polished, groomed, turned into something between a servant and a toy. Solomon was chosen not because he was weak, but because he was strong in ways they thought they understood. They believed silence was submission. They believed obedience was loyalty. They believed he was theirs. But silence for Solomon was not weakness. It was survival. And in that survival, a seed of vengeance had already taken root. The house he was taken into was no home. It was a theater of shadows, a palace built on broken bones. From the outside it gleamed. White columns rising against the sky, shutters painted in crisp, proud colors. A porch lined with rocking chairs where masters sipped whiskey and spoke of politics, liberty and God. But inside, behind the polished wood and velvet drapes, the air reeked of rot. The kind of rot that does not come from dead animals or spoiled food, but from the dead soul of a nation pretending to be righteous. Solomon learned quickly. He carried trays. He polished boots. He fetched books from the library for the master's children. He became a ghost in the halls, drifting unnoticed, his eyes down, his ears wide open. And the things he heard, they cut deeper than whips. He heard the laughter of men as they spoke of slaves as though they were tools. He heard the screams of women dragged down corridors while the rest of the house pretended not to hear. He heard prayers to God offered by mouths still wet with sin. But worst of all, he heard his own name. Spoken softly at first. Then more often. Then daily. Solomon Carter. A boy. A child. They took him to the rooms no slave spoke of. The rooms behind locked doors where candles burned low, where shadows danced like demons against the walls. There his silence was tested. There his body was branded not with iron but with shame. There the boy who might have grown into a man was broken into fragments of obedience and fear. Yet even in those nights Solomon never forgot who he was. Every lash, every hand, every whisper, he carried it all like scripture carved into his bones. He studied his enemies the way a hawk studies prey. He memorized their footsteps, their routines, their weaknesses. He learned which doors creaked, which locks could be broken, which overseers drank too much, and which guards slept too heavily. He learned who could be trusted among the slaves, and who had already been broken beyond return. He learned above all patience, because patience is the weapon of the powerless. The scars began to show not on his body but in his eyes. To the masters he was still quiet, still obedient, still perfect. They saw only what they wanted to see. But to those who lived in the cabins beyond the fields, the truth was visible. The women whispered of him. The men nodded to him in silence. They saw in him not a boy but something else, a storm building in human form. His mother, worn and bent from years of endless labor, touched his face one night as he returned from the house. She looked into his eyes and saw not her son, but a shadow of the man he was becoming. And she knew. She knew that this boy, her boy, was carrying something larger than himself. Something dangerous, something inevitable. "Do not speak," she told him. "Not yet. But when the time comes, let the silence end." Solomon did not answer. He didn't need to. His silence was the answer. And so the years passed. The boy became taller, his shoulders heavier, his arms stronger from work. His face hardened not with age but with memory. Every day he served at the master's table, every night he returned to the cabin of his people, and in between those two worlds he carried a secret, that one day he would burn the house that had burned him. The masters could not see it. They had confused his silence for surrender. They believed they had broken him. But they had only taught him the art of waiting. They had sharpened the blade of his patience until it gleamed like steel. And somewhere in the darkness of those fields, the whispers began. Whispers of a boy who was more than a boy. Whispers of a storm that was coming. Whispers of a child who remembered everything. By the time Solomon Carter turned 15, the whispers had become prophecy. The plantation house stood like a monument to hypocrisy. White columns rising in defiance of the suffering that built them, polished floors gleaming while the earth outside ran red. It was a palace of illusions. A structure that pretended to be civilization while inside, it was nothing more than a lair of predators. To the world it was wealth. To those chained beyond its walls, it was hell with shutters. And inside this house Solomon Carter lived a double life. By day he was the boy with lowered eyes, carrying trays, fetching shoes, polishing brass until his reflection stared back at him in warped fragments. He was silent, invisible, a shadow gliding between rooms. But by night he was a witness. Because night revealed the truth of the house. There were rooms that were never spoken of. Rooms with doors that locked from the inside. Rooms where candles burned too low, where curtains were drawn too tightly, where screams could be swallowed whole by thick padded walls. The masters called them parlors. But the slaves called them what they were, the shadows. It was there that Solomon was taken. At first he thought it was a mistake. A boy of 13 had no place in the shadows. But the masters had other uses for him. His silence, once his shield, was now their invitation. They wanted him because he was handsome, because he was obedient, because he would not scream. And so the shadows became his prison. The things that happened there were unspeakable. Children dragged in and never seen again. Women broken and returned to the fields like shattered glass. Boys told they were special, then tossed aside when the novelty faded. In the shadows there was no law, no God, no humanity. Only appetite. Solomon endured it all. His body scarred in ways that would never heal, his innocence burned away in nights that felt longer than years. Yet even there, even in the pit of his degradation, he never gave them what they wanted. He never begged. He never pleaded. He never broke. His silence, the very thing they had chosen him for, became his rebellion. They thought it meant weakness. They never understood it was a weapon. Because silence remembers. In those halls he studied. While the masters laughed, while overseers drank, while children of the house slept soundly, Solomon listened. He learned which doors were weak, which locks could be picked, which windows could be forced open. He memorized the rhythm of the guards' footsteps, the pattern of their drunken stagger. He saw where the rifles were kept, how often they were cleaned, how many bullets remained. He learned more than geography. He learned people. He watched the master's wife, who turned her eyes away from the screams, clutching her Bible tighter, convincing herself she was holy. He watched the overseer, whose cruelty was not fueled by power but by fear. Fear that one day the slaves would rise and he would be the first to fall. He watched the other children, who laughed in innocence, not yet poisoned by the sins of their fathers, yet destined to inherit the same rot. And most of all he watched the slaves themselves. Some were broken, their eyes dulled, their voices hollow. They were already dead, though their bodies still moved. Others still fought in small ways. A hidden word, a stolen tool, a whispered prayer. And a few, a dangerous few, still carried fire in their eyes. Men and women who dreamed of freedom even if it killed them. These were the ones Solomon marked. These were the ones he would need. But patience is cruel. Years passed and Solomon endured. He was 15 now, taller, stronger, the beginnings of a man carved out of the ruins of a boy. The shadows still claimed him, but they no longer frightened him. They only fueled him. Each night of horror became another entry in the ledger of vengeance he carried in his heart. Each scar became another reminder that he was owed blood. And then the cracks began to show. The masters, bloated on their own security, did not see it. But Solomon did. He saw the way the slaves whispered to each other when the guards were drunk. He saw the way stolen food disappeared into hidden corners. He saw the way certain men lingered near the edge of the fields at night, as though waiting for a signal that never came. And slowly he began to weave himself into their trust. At first he said nothing. He simply watched. Then came small gestures. A shared glance, a nod, a loaf of bread hidden in a cloth. Then words, whispered so low the wind itself could not hear. Wait. Watch. Not yet. Because Solomon knew the danger of rebellion born too soon. He had seen what happened when slaves rose without plan or patience. Whole families slaughtered, cabins burned, men torn apart in public as warnings. A rebellion that failed was worse than silence. No, he would not fail. But every storm has its spark. For Solomon, it came one night when a girl barely 12 was dragged into the shadows. Her screams pierced even the thick walls, louder than any before. He knew her. She had carried water to the fields. She had smiled at him once, shy and fleeting, the smile of someone who had not yet been broken. And now she was gone. Something in Solomon snapped. Not loudly. Not with fury. But silently, like a rope tightening. His silence hardened into something new. Something no whip, no lock, no hand could break. That night when he returned to the cabin he spoke for the first time in years. His voice was low, cracked, but steady. They will pay. The words spread like fire in dry grass. From cabin to cabin, field to field, until every whisper carried the same promise. They will pay. And in that moment Solomon ceased to be a boy. He became a storm. By 16 Solomon Carter was no longer a boy. The cotton fields that once seemed endless now looked like graves waiting to be filled. Each row of white fluff was watered with the sweat of men, the tears of women and the blood of children. And Solomon carried them all in silence. But silence had changed. It was no longer just a shield. It was now a language, a code that only the enslaved could understand. Every glance, every pause, every gesture held meaning. And beneath the overseer's gaze, a rebellion was being written in silence. The first to stand beside him was Ezekiel, a man whose back was a map of scars. He had been whipped so many times that the overseers joked he was more leather than flesh. Yet his eyes still burned. His faith was old, heavy, unbreakable. Not the faith of the Master's Bible but something older, African, ancestral, carried across the ocean in chains. Ezekiel believed Solomon was chosen. Not by chance, not by men, but by spirits. Then there was Ruth, a woman hardened by grief. She had birthed 3 children, and all 3 had been taken from her before they could speak. She moved like a shadow, silent, invisible. But she listened, and when Solomon spoke she carried his words like fire through the cabins. And finally there was Jonah, no older than Solomon but reckless, angry, a boy who had once tried to stab an overseer with a broken blade. He was caught, beaten near death, left as an example. But he survived. His anger became Solomon's weapon, raw, dangerous, but loyal. Together they became the first circle. Solomon's rebellion was not forged in fire. Not yet. It began in whispers, in small acts no one noticed. A tool hidden here. A rope cut there. A door left unlocked. A match tucked into the corner of a cabin. Every act was a piece of the storm. By day Solomon was still the obedient servant, carrying trays, polishing boots, fetching books. By night he was something else, a teacher. He taught the others what he had learned. The timing of the guards, the placement of rifles, the weakness in the locks. He drew maps in the dirt, showing where fire would spread fastest, where the horses were kept, where the children of the masters slept. And always he reminded them, not yet. Because Solomon understood something few others did. Fear was stronger than chains. If they rose too soon and failed, the survivors would be slaughtered, the memory erased. But if they waited, if they struck like thunder in the dead of night, fear would spread not just through the plantation but through the entire South. He wasn't planning revenge. He was planning war. Yet war requires more than anger. It requires patience. And patience is the hardest chain of all. For months Solomon held them back. Each new cruelty threatened to break the silence. A man beaten until his ribs cracked. A woman dragged into the shadows, returned in pieces. A child starved to death for stealing bread. Each time Jonah wanted to strike, wanted to fight. Each time Solomon stopped him. Not yet, he whispered. When the storm breaks, it must break everything. And so the storm gathered in silence. But storms do not go unnoticed. The overseer, a man named Harlan, began to sense something. He was cruel, but he was not a fool. He had lived long enough to smell rebellion. He saw the way the slaves watched Solomon, the way their eyes followed him. He saw the nods, the glances, the whispers. One night he cornered Solomon in the barn. His voice was thick with whiskey, his breath foul. "You think I don't see it, boy? You think I don't know?" He pressed the cold steel of a pistol against Solomon's chest. "You try anything, and I'll gut you myself." Solomon did not flinch. He did not blink. He only looked at Harlan with those burning, silent eyes. And in that silence Harlan saw something that chilled him deeper than any blade. He saw patience. He saw certainty. He saw death waiting. The pistol lowered. The overseer walked away. But his fear betrayed him. Because when men in power fear, they make mistakes. And Solomon was waiting for mistakes. The first real test came weeks later. A shipment of rifles arrived, bound for the militia. They were stored in the plantation's barn for one night. Just one. Solomon saw his chance. That night, under the cover of silence, he led Ezekiel, Ruth, and Jonah to the barn. The lock was easy. Solomon had studied it for years. Inside, rows of rifles gleamed in the moonlight. They took only a few, enough to hide, enough to test the system. By dawn the rifles were gone. Harlan raged. The masters panicked. Searches were conducted, cabins torn apart. But nothing was found. The rifles had vanished. And for the first time the slaves saw what Solomon already knew. The masters were not gods. They were men. Men who could be outwitted. Men who could be afraid. The silence grew heavier. The storm grew darker. But the spark that would ignite it all came not from Solomon, but from the masters themselves. One night, in the shadows of the great house, the master's youngest son, no older than 12, laughed as he struck Solomon with a riding crop. "You're nothing," the boy said. "You'll always be nothing." Solomon stood still, silent, the sting burning across his cheek. But in his heart something shifted. He realized then that the poison was not just in the fathers. It was in the sons. It was in the blood. It would not stop. It would never stop. Unless he stopped it. That night Solomon returned to the cabins. His circle was waiting. Jonah with his rage. Ruth with her silence. Ezekiel with his faith. He did not whisper this time. He spoke. His voice was steady, heavy, final. "The time has come." And in that moment the storm that had gathered for years was ready to break. The night chosen was moonless, thick with the kind of darkness that feels alive. The air itself was heavy, waiting, as if the earth had been holding its breath for centuries and was about to exhale. For weeks, the slaves had whispered of this night in silence. For years, Solomon had carried it in his bones. Now the storm was ready. He stood in the cabin, the circle gathered around him. Ezekiel with his prayers, Jonah with his blade, Ruth with her quiet fire. Dozens more pressed into the shadows. Men and women who had lived too long in chains, who had swallowed their fear until it curdled into rage. Each one carried something: a knife, a hammer, a sharpened tool, a stolen rifle. Weapons of the enslaved. Weapons of the desperate. Solomon did not shout. He did not need to. His voice was low, calm, final. "Tonight the house burns. Tonight they pay." The first strike came in silence. 2 guards at the edge of the field never saw it coming. Jonah slipped through the dark, blade flashing once, twice, and they were gone. Their rifles were taken before their bodies hit the ground. Their silence was added to Solomon's own. From there the fire spread. A torch was lit and tossed into the barn, the dry hay erupting in flames that clawed toward the sky. The horses screamed, the animals thrashed, and within minutes the night was no longer quiet. Smoke bled into the stars. The overseer Harlan stumbled from his quarters, shouting orders, drunk and confused. He never finished his words. Ezekiel struck him down with a hammer, each blow falling like thunder, each strike a prayer to ancestors long dead. By the time he fell silent, the man who had carved so many scars into black flesh was nothing but a broken husk on the dirt. And still the storm grew. The great house stood proud, its white columns glowing ghost-like in the firelight. Inside, the masters awoke to chaos. Windows shattered, doors splintered. The slaves, their slaves, poured into the house like a tide of vengeance. Solomon was the first through the door. He moved like a shadow, blade in hand, eyes burning with years of silence. The master himself rose from his bed, reaching for the pistol on the nightstand. Too slow. Solomon struck once, clean and final. The man who had ruled over his life with whip and chain fell without a word, his blood staining the sheets he had once dirted with others' pain. The mistress screamed, clutching her Bible, praying to a God who had never answered the prayers of the enslaved. Ruth was the one who silenced her. Not with cruelty but with cold justice. A single slash across the throat. A reminder that scripture cannot wash away sin. Room by room the house was consumed. The sons tried to fight. One fired a pistol, the shot grazing Jonah's arm. But rage is stronger than pain. Jonah dragged the boy down, blade flashing, laughter twisted into screams that ended too quickly. The daughters cowered, begging, pleading. But there was no mercy. Not tonight. Not in the house of shadows. Because mercy is for the innocent. And innocence had died long ago on this land. The fire spread faster than the blood. Curtains ignited, wood cracked, the walls themselves seemed to cry as flames devoured them. The house groaned like a dying beast. Paintings of proud ancestors curled and blackened, their faces melting into smoke. Chandeliers crashed to the ground, glass shattering in a storm of sparks. Through it all Solomon moved like a phantom. Every step was deliberate, every strike measured. He was not killing for pleasure. He was killing for memory. Every scar on his back, every scream he had heard in the shadows, every child stolen into the night, all of it spoke through his blade. And outside the fields erupted. Cabins were emptied, chains shattered. Men and women ran, some into the flames, some into the night, some into freedom. The overseer's dogs, unleashed, turned wild, attacking anyone in reach before vanishing into the chaos. The plantation, once a monument of control, was now nothing but ruin. But even storms carry cost. Jonah, reckless, laughing through the fire, was struck by a musket ball. He fell in the doorway, blood soaking the floor. Ruth dragged him into the night, but his eyes were already glassy, his smile fading. "We're free," he whispered before the silence claimed him. Ezekiel too paid his price. In the chaos he was trapped beneath a burning beam, his voice rising not in screams but in song, a hymn older than the house itself. His last breath was not despair but defiance, his words carrying over the crackling flames. "We are not slaves tonight." Their deaths were not wasted. They were offerings. They were the price of justice. By dawn the house was nothing but ash. The fields were blackened, the barn destroyed, the overseers and masters gone. Where once had stood a monument to slavery, there was now only ruin. And in the center of that ruin stood Solomon Carter. His face was streaked with soot, his body scarred and bleeding, but his eyes burned with something untouchable. Around him survivors gathered. Women clutching children. Men clutching weapons. Dozens who had lived through the night, staring at him not as a boy, not even as a man but as something else. A symbol. Solomon said nothing. He did not need to. His silence spoke louder than any words. Because silence had become fire. Silence had become vengeance. Silence had become freedom. The storm had broken. And with it the old world burned. But storms do not last forever. Already the horizon carried a new threat. The sound of riders, the scent of gunpowder, the promise of retribution. The South would not forgive. The South would not forget. The question was no longer whether Solomon Carter could destroy the house. That was done. The question was whether he could survive the fire he himself had unleashed. The sun rose over a world unrecognizable. Where once the fields of Carter Plantation had shimmered in endless rows of green cotton, there now lay nothing but smoldering ruin. Ash clung to the air, black and choking. The great house, proud and white, was nothing more than a blackened skeleton, its columns collapsed, its roof consumed. The overseer's quarters were cinders, the barn a heap of glowing rubble. It was as if a god had passed through the land in the night, leaving judgment in his wake. But to Solomon Carter and the survivors who stood among the ruins, this was not divine. It was human. It was earned. They buried Jonah at the edge of the field where he had first picked cotton as a boy. The earth was soft, the soil black with ash, and his blood mingled with it as Ruth and others lowered him into the ground. There were no priests, no sermons. Only Ezekiel's last hymn, repeated softly by the survivors until it became a chant, a prayer, a promise. Then they buried Ezekiel himself, his body charred from where the beam had crushed him, his face frozen in song. They placed him beneath the charred stump of the overseer's gallows, turning the site of countless deaths into his resting ground. 2 graves. 2 martyrs. 2 seeds planted in the soil of rebellion. But mourning could not last long. Before the sun reached its height, the riders came. Armed men from neighboring plantations, summoned by smoke on the horizon, their horses foaming with sweat. They carried muskets, pistols, and rage. They were not soldiers but slavers defending their order, and their fear made them dangerous. Solomon saw them first from the treeline. He knew what they came for. Retribution. Not justice, not law. Retribution. The South demanded blood for blood, silence for silence. He turned to the survivors. Some clutched children, others clutched weapons. Their eyes burned with both fear and hope. "We can't fight them head-on," Ruth said, her voice sharp, steady despite the tears drying on her cheeks. "Not with what we have left." Solomon did not answer with words. He simply lifted his hand and the survivors followed him into the forest. The riders arrived minutes later to find only ruin. They cursed, spat, and searched the ashes for survivors, for bodies. They found the graves and they desecrated them, digging them up and leaving the corpses exposed to rot in the sun. They shouted promises of vengeance, swore oaths to hunt Solomon Carter down, to hang him from the highest tree, to make an example of anyone who dared follow his path. But Solomon was already gone. For weeks, the survivors moved through the swamps and forests, guided by Solomon's silence. They avoided patrols, slipped through marshes, and left no trail but whispers. Some broke off, heading north in hopes of freedom. Some disappeared into maroon camps hidden deep in the bayous, where escaped slaves had built secret villages that even hunters feared to enter. But Solomon did not flee. Oh, Solomon lingered. Like a phantom he struck back. When riders passed through a narrow trail, shots echoed from the trees. When overseers rode out to search the woods, they vanished. Their horses returned riderless, saddles soaked in blood. A plantation to the south awoke to find its barn burned, its cattle slaughtered, its master's throat cut in his bed. Another to the west lost 3 guards in the night, their corpses hung upside down on the gates at dawn. Every act bore the mark of Solomon Carter. Not in words but in silence. He left no letters, no proclamations. He left symbols carved into wood, into bark, into the bones of his enemies. A single mark. 3 vertical lines, 1 horizontal slash. The brand of chains broken. The South began to whisper his name like a curse. The silent storm. The phantom slave. The devil of the swamps. But among the enslaved his name became something else. A hymn. A prayer. A weapon. Masters feared him. Preachers warned of him. And yet no one could catch him. Entire militias were raised to hunt Solomon. Dogs were set loose. Bounties were posted, entire counties searched. But he always slipped through their grasp. Sometimes a hunter's camp would wake to find their food stolen, their weapons missing. Sometimes one would wake to find a companion gone, his body discovered later, hanging from a tree with Solomon's mark carved into his chest. Fear spread faster than fire. And fear was a weapon Solomon wielded better than any blade. Yet even storms cannot last forever. The years weighed on Solomon. He watched companions die one by one, some to bullets, some to betrayal, some to disease. He buried them in silence, planting his grief in the soil of the South. Ruth stayed with him the longest, her fire undimmed. Together they carved a path of vengeance that shook plantations across 2 states. But one winter she was caught in an ambush. Solomon found her body nailed to a tree, her eyes gouged out, her tongue cut, her mark burned into her flesh as mockery. For the first time in his life, Solomon wept. But his tears were not weakness. They were the sharpening of steel. That winter 3 plantations burned to the ground. Entire families vanished into the swamp, their bodies never found. And the mark of chains broken appeared in blood on their walls. No one knows exactly how Solomon Carter died. Some say he was finally caught, dragged in chains to the square of New Orleans, hanged before a roaring crowd. They say he never spoke a word, not even at the noose. His silence was his final defiance. Others say he vanished into the swamps, too wild, too untouchable to be killed. That he became a ghost, stalking the South forever, striking down masters in the night. And some say he made it north. That he crossed into freedom, that he lived long enough to see the war come, long enough to see the South burn for real. They say he even fought in that war not as Solomon Carter but as the storm itself. But truth does not matter. What matters is the legacy. Because long after the fires were gone, long after the graves were forgotten, his story lived. Told in whispers around slave cabins. Sung in hidden hymns that white ears could never quite understand. Passed from mouth to mouth, generation to generation, until Solomon Carter was no longer a man. He was silence itself. The silence that watches. The silence that waits. The silence that burns. And so, when the chains finally fell, when the war was done and the South lay in ashes, there were freedmen who still carried his mark on their skin, carved into their flesh, tattooed into their arms. 3 vertical lines, 1 horizontal slash. Chains broken. They carried it not as memory but as prophecy. Because storms pass. But silence endures.